Your brain is like a smartphone with powerful apps pre-installed. Memory, attention, reasoning, and learning. The problem, most of us never open the settings or learn how to use them well. But once you do, just like turning on notifications, activating focus mode, or using cloud storage, your ability to learn unlocks in ways you didn't think were possible. My name is George Hanshaw. I'm here today with Craig Brewer and Shannon Hunt, where we are going to dive into how do I learn and hopefully unlock some secrets for us. So, Shannon and Craig, how would you define cognition or learning? How would you define that?
I'm happy to start, George. Welcome, everyone. Glad to be with you. With cognition, the definition we've got here is the mental action or process of acquiring knowledge and understanding through thought, experience, and the senses. So it's all three of those things. It's your thinking, it's your experiences, our learned experiences, and it's our senses. And we use those things to try to make sense of our world.
So there's a whole lot of major functions that happen with that. What are some of those major things that create that so we can get that mental action or processing to acquire that knowledge and be able to use it, right? Because our experience, all those senses, what are some of those major functions?
Yeah, let me just provide a brief overview of some of those functions, and then feel free to jump in. But memory is the first one, and memory talks about how we store and retrieve information over short or long periods of time. It includes working memory, short-term and long-term memory, and it's critical for learning, decision-making, and identity. So that's one of the topics we're going to talk about today. Attention's another one. It filters the information you focus on and what matters. So oftentimes, many of us multitask, right?
Right.
Multitask, the research says we're not as effective because our attention is split. But the types are selective, sustained, divided, and alternating. And so without attention, learning and memory struggle to hold. So whatever we put our attention on, that's where our learning and memory is going to be. We've got language as well. So that's our communication through structuring, and it involves our comprehension. That's our ability to comprehend, our expression, our reading, and our writing. And then problem solving looks at logic, reasoning, and creativity to find solutions. That involves critical thinking, decision-making, and strategy use. The last one I'll talk about is perception. And perception it's our brain's interpretation of our sensory input, what we see, hear, feel. And it turns raw data from our environment into meaningful experiences. And it's really the foundation for learning and interacting in our world. So that's a brief overview. Let me turn it over to you, Shannon or George, to highlight any of those areas.
Sure. I think, George, your initial question was like, how do we create this thing of cognition? And Craig but he read for us a really good definition about acquiring thoughts and understanding. And it has three components, right? It really has to do with our experiences, our senses, and then the thoughts. So all three of those components come together to create this cognition. And Craig, you're breaking down some aspects of that we utilize. And one is memory. I always love talking about memory. I don't know about you guys, but we think about memory, and one of the fun things, there's three types of memories usually that we're talking about, and Craig touched on them. Like we have sensory memory, short-term memory, long-term memory, that type of thing. Just part of cognition that's really interesting. Are you guys familiar with the sensory memory part? It's like our brain picks up the senses around us. So what we see, what we hear, what we touch, what we smell. And it's short-term, very short sensory memory. But a lot of times people will ask questions about dreams. Have you guys ever had someone ask you questions about dreams before, right? Okay, so our senses pick up these pieces, and it's translated into the language of the brain. And things that we might pass by on a subway, maybe we're walking by someone in the store, we hear something in a podcast or a TV or something, and our senses pick up something we see, we hear, and it might show up in one of our dreams later. Have you ever had that question, like, where did that come from? But even how our brain is so cool, how it works, like even the things that we just go into our memory for a minute second that we might pass by, our brain processes that, and it can show up even later into our dreams. Have you had someone ask you that question before? How does this turn up in my dreams?
Right. Yeah. And the other thing I'll highlight, Shannon, is the sense of smell is kind of fascinating. I've been working with people and they've smelled something, and the smell takes them back to a memory. And so it's really kind of fascinating how there's power in that. And so depending on how we engaged in the world, or what we heard, saw, smelled, all these different senses tied to our memories, which I think is really, really fascinating.
Right.
You know, I have a fun story about that, because senses, when they will help you remember, you'll recall different memories and such,
Absolutely.
right? Well, and this is kind of funny. In basic training, our barracks was right above the chow hall. So when you'd wake, they'd start cooking bacon at like 4 a.m, right? So the smell of bacon was big, and it was extremely cold. And then you go outside and it was extremely hot, right? They were just trying to, do whatever they do. So the smell of bacon, I didn't know connected that memory, because one day I walked out, I was a little bit sleepy, just woken up, and I was about getting ready to go get some food. And I walked out of my literal house, years later, right, where I had the air conditioner on, it was nice and cool, and then it was hot when I walked out of the house. And I freaked out because I couldn't find my cover, and because you always had to wear a cover.
Right.
I was like, man, I'm at home.
That's right.
What is going on right now?
Right. Oh, that is a great example. Yeah, right. And it's really cool, because if we think about how we pick up senses, and it's translated through the thalamus, which is a part of the brain, to the language of the brain. And we have these two parts of the brain. We have the hippocampus and the amygdala. And are you guys familiar with Daniel Goleman? He is an expert in emotional intelligence, has written a number of books. We use one of their books in one of our classes here, our emotional intelligence classes. And I love how he defines the distinction between the operating portion of the hippocampus versus the amygdala. So he says the hippocampus, it retains the dry facts, and the amygdala has the emotional part of that. So it's a great way to distinguish. So George, like you're talking about here, when you smelled the bacon, it coordinates the dry facts of what it was, but also to the emotional flavor of what you experienced in training. And so how our brain works together. It's really cool how our brain works together with the different aspects of memory. We have a short-term memory, which is working. Imagine with me, 2-factor authentication, right? Okay, so we have email and we have phone, and we get a 2-factor authentication sent to our phone that we need to use in the email. Short-term working memory is memorizing those 6 numbers and then inputting it on your computer. So that's another part of our memory, our short-term memory. And then we have the long-term memory as well, which has much more room in our brain, so we can incorporate and we can download, so to speak, memories for longer. So our brain and how it works with memory is we will encode, and then it's stored, and then we're able to retrieve it later. So those are the 3 working modes of memory in our brain, those 3 things. It encodes from the senses and what we're picking up the information, and then it stores it, and later we retrieve it and compare it to other information that is also stored in our brain.
I want to highlight what you shared, Shannon, with the attention part of that as well. So I don't know if any of you have had this experience, but I've been driving somewhere that I've gone a lot of times. I get in the car and I start driving, and all of a sudden I'm either there or I'm at a different location that I wasn't supposed to be at. And I say, what happened? How did I get where I'm at? So a fascinating thing about attention is, if we're doing things that we've done over and over and over again, our mind oftentimes goes on autopilot, and we're not paying attention to the driving. I'm thinking about something else. And because my attention's not on it, I don't remember it. And so this gets into levels of consciousness. And the way the brain works is depending on where our attention's at, that's where our level of consciousness is. If we have a very low attention to it, and we're not paying attention, then we don't have that same level of consciousness. And therefore, I think it's just really fascinating because I can't tell you how many times something like that's happened. And I've come back and just said, I don't remember the drive.
Right.
So that's crazy. So we're saying that the sensors, all of our sensors, whatever we have, touch, smell, the level of attention that we're paying, all of that factors into our memory, how well we retain it.
Right.
And I think that there's a lot of talk about memory and recall and such, and how it's a lower level of learning, right? But we have to be able to recall facts in order to use them. If we don't know them, we can't get to those higher levels, right? So it's kind of neat to think that we can do things to help us remember better. Shannon talked about encoding, and really, so in the way that I understand encoding, and please piggyback on this because you have more insight than I do, but a lot of encoding is how we take that in and then what we do with it in terms of preparing it. Like, do we have an Amazon style warehouse where everything has its spot? And can we take this new information and connect it with this schema or location that we already have? Because, correct me if I'm wrong, but if we are learning something new and we're able to connect it to something we already hold, it's going to stick better. And that's what we want to do, is make learning stick, right?
Right.
Would you say that's fairly accurate?
Yes, I think everything that we are taking in new information, right? That's part of the learning process. We're taking in new information, and our brain is comparing it to what's already stored, the information that we already have in there. And so part of learning is the combination of new information, new knowledge, new senses, new experiences, combined with what's already in there, comparing. And then what we want to see with learning too is that there is a distinction. Something's different moving forward, right? So we have a new behavior, a new thought, that type of thing. If it's coming in and there's not any difference, it's just storing in your memory. But with learning, we are taking something and there's going to be some type of transition. There's going to be a newer thought, a newer behavior, that type of thing. Does that make sense?
That makes total sense.
Absolutely. And I'm thinking now, Shannon, of the brain and the brain, how that brain works. And there's this concept we call neuroplasticity. It's the brain's ability to recognize itself by forming new connections. And so what Shannon talked about before is we've got the hippocampus, that focuses on memory. We've got the prefrontal cortex, executive function, and then the amygdala, which is emotion. And so the brain is making connections between these three, and that's part of how we learn.
Right. Absolutely. And if we think back to even George's scenario too, of how he was able to, the smell of bacon brought him right back to when he was in training, and he was ready to put the cap on his head too. We can understand even more so when people have had any type of like trauma disorders, and there things that they see, they hear, they smell, they touch. It can bring the memory brings them back to that type of location where they were in their mind's eye when they experienced the trauma. So it can also trigger trauma responses as well. So one beautiful thing about neuroplasticity, Craig, to your point too, is we can create new neural pathways in the brain as well. And that goes to our learning piece as well. The more we repeat something, obviously we know there's type of memory like the implicit memory. Like, I just know how to ride a bike. I've done it so many times. I haven't actually ridden a bike in a little bit. When I say a little bit, it's been probably a few years since I've ridden a bike, but I know if I get on, I know how to ride a bike, right? So that implicit memory that we have. But with the go ahead.
I was just going to say, in the context of therapy, Shannon, if you're working with a client and they have a memory of something that happened perhaps in childhood that would have been traumatic for them, by engaging with them and allowing them to tell that story, Are you able to, how does that tie in? Are they able to create a new way, a new memory that has a positive impact on that older memory, or how does that work?
It's a great question. So, and it's a very complex answer. I'm thinking of all the different layers of memory and how that is, how it's formed when there's trauma. And there's even false memories in there too. But we can learn how to reframe and look at situations, right? So the further removed we move away from trauma, sometimes the information is a little bit blurry, so to speak, compared to what we experience, and how we filter what we experience. The lenses we use, our perception. We're going to talk about perception later. It can change over times too of the trauma that we experience. So just to kind of give the hope piece of this, with the neuroplasticity of the brain, we can learn, we can train our brain to start thinking differently as well. Doesn't mean that necessarily we can completely remove the memory of what happened to us, right? What trauma happened, but we can be able to learn new things about the trauma. We can learn how to metacognition, like learning to manage our thoughts about the trauma, that type of thing. So does that answer? That is a very a sliver in response to your question, because the complexity of the responses to that question dives a lot deeper. We could talk about EMDR,
Right.
all types of things in terms of therapeutic intervention, how to help with those trauma memories. But it's just a kind of slice off the top about that.
Sure. Yeah. And you mentioned metacognition, Shannon, and that's thinking about our thinking.
Right.
Right. And when we do that, when we think about our thinking, that takes us to another level of thinking and helps us to, I think, make sense oftentimes of our thoughts.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely.
Great points. So this kind of brings us up to Shannon foreshadowed perception, perspective.
Mm-hmm.
So I always heard an interesting thing. Each of us individually we have our own perception. Everybody else has a perspective.
Mm-hmm.
And we don't know what their perspective is because it's a set of their past experiences and how we've seen things. It's like what I like to tell people to do is, all right, so imagine you're seeing something off at the distance. You don't quite know what it is, but it kind of has something familiar. So you run through your mind all these things that you think it might be, because that's your perception of all your previous experiences and everything that you've known before. So you're not going to come up with anything new, but you're going to run through should we call it a catalog maybe, or a library of our experiences to try to identify what that is. So how would you say that, and it sounds like that perception and perspective kind of tie back to those connecting new learning with previous learning?
Yeah. Absolutely.
So how can people use that as a powerful tool to help them learn?
So I'll just start by just a quick definition here. So when we think perception, we're thinking about how the brain interprets sensory input from the environment, sight, sound, touch, etc. And we talk perspective. That's now the perception shapes our perspective. That's our viewpoint shaped by experience, value, culture, and beliefs. And so one of the fascinating things that we oftentimes talk about is bias. And we all have biases because we all have different subjective experiences. And those experiences are what we draw from when we're thinking. So for example, if we had an encounter with someone at a younger age, and it didn't go well, right? That's in our mind now. And so when we're working with someone else, that might trigger that experience, and that brings up the bias. And that's one of the really important things of doing some of this work about really looking at our perspective and how we gained it. And is it objective? And we know from the research that we're not objective as human beings, because we tend to be really subjective, and we tend to base everything based on our past experiences. And that part of that could be argued as a survival technique, right? So in order to survive, we learn and we adapt. But the problem with that is oftentimes we can learn the wrong things with bias. And then we're not even oftentimes aware of what those biases are. And so I think part of it too is realizing that the perspective that we have is not an objective perspective. It's very subjective based on our experiences and how we've tied meaning to that.
So then if we're learning something and we're learning something incorrect, something biased, whatever it may be. So now we not only have that as part of our part of our schema, we have to remove it or adjust it in order to learn new stuff, right? Or we're not going to take in the new content or information. Would that be correct?
Yeah, that's metacognition, right? We can think about our thinking and our biases and how we got where we're at, and we can evaluate that, and then we can change our thinking and our process through awareness of some of those experiences and how those experiences have shaped us. And then we can make a decision cognitively, an aware decision about where we want to move forward to with some of those things. I think that's one of the beautiful things about engaging in therapy is it gives you the opportunity to really do a deep dive and look at our background and all these personal things that have happened to us, and then to see how has that shaped our perspective. And then we can make a decision. We're thinking about our thinking in metacognition and say, I don't want to continue to think that way anymore. I realize that may have occurred to me, but that's not a fair assumption. And so that really gets at, in my view, we talk about Maslow and kind of the hierarchy as well. And as we grow and develop as individuals, part of it is having an awareness of some of those things and ensuring that we're not projecting those biases onto other people through life, that we've done our due diligence, we've done the work, and we've become aware of some of those things and worked through those things and changed our thinking processes.
That's amazing. So as we wrap this up, those are some very powerful comments that both of you made. So to kind of summarize, the emotion or the sense helps with memory, helps with retaining content knowledge. Metacognition, thinking about thinking, can help us connect to current content within our mind so we can make learning stick better. And it can help us change maybe we learned something incorrect. Or one thing that I've found out for me personally, that I've been becoming a bit of a data nerd. A lot of the data that I learned prior to machine learning, it's not incorrect, but it's not current either. So I have to learn to think a different way about data, which was a fun thing to do. So that's kind of the metacognition piece. So what advice would you give? Let's all give our favorite strategy or technique to be able to learn better so they can get through
You kind of broke up on me. George, did you ask for our favorite strategy for learning? Is that what your question was?
Yes. What is your favorite strategy? We'll give them 3 strategies. We'll each give our favorite.
And so strategies, you're not talking about specific learning theories. You're just like, what works for you? That type of thing.
Yeah. Where the rubber meets the road, I need to learn this. I need to be able to solve complex problems creatively with what I have in my head. Mm-hmm. How do you help me get that knowledge into my head?
Right. That's great. That's a great question. And we're not going to touch on learning styles because I know you have a viewpoint on that. I'm sure we're going to touch on that later. However, I think there's a lot to do, at least for myself. Active learning is incredibly important. So if I learn something, I need to put it into practice, right? So even if I'm learning something, if I'm reading something, my next step is going to be especially if I'm going to be teaching something, I'm going to be vocalizing that. So it's taking something in, and then I'm imagining teaching these concepts. And the more I do it, then the more I become familiar with what I'm doing. So I need to do an active learning component with something that I'm bringing in, right? So, and active learning could be a number of different avenues, but as long as I'm not just trying to read something over and over again and doing nothing with that's not helping me. I need to take that and either write it out, speak it out, teach it to someone else, that type of thing. And that helps me to retain. And then also look at it. Did I understand this correctly? And then compare it to other past information I have and new information I have to see if it's correct, and then adapt with that as well.
Oh,
There's
nice.
a few different metacognitive strategies. One of them is self-monitoring, and that's understanding as you go. And part of that is if we're teaching other people, we're able to do that. But cognitive behavioral therapy ties into this as well with self-monitoring, using self-talk. Oftentimes, our thinking might go back to certain patterns and rhythms that are negative thinking patterns. So for me, part of learning is to not allow myself to ruminate on those negative thoughts and to use a cognitive approach with self-talk to say, hey, stop that, Craig, if I'm beating myself up, to remind myself, you don't need to do that, and constantly kind of checking my thinking. Another part is goal setting and planning with learning, and having achievable timelines and goals as we can continue to learn. I think one of the things I want to share about too is part of it is a heart thing as well as we learn. For me, part of it's being humble and realizing I don't have all the answers, and the answers I may have had in the past may no longer be relevant today. So part of it's also this growth mindset to say, I'm coming into this as a learner myself, and I'm continually opening myself up to learning. I don't want to close myself off to new thoughts or ideas because I think I know it all. And then the last one I'll share is just introspection and continually taking time to journal. And if I have feelings that are strong about a certain topic, doing a deeper dive and saying, what is it about that topic that's leading to these feelings? And looking at what was the learning that I had that probably led to that outcome. And again, part of that notion of metacognition.
Those are great. You know what I do? I quiz. So Shannon brought up active learning. Craig, you brought up some great points. And I quiz because I'll kind of drift when I read a little bit. So I'll read a couple paragraphs, and then I will literally ask myself, why is this important? Does it connect to anything I already know? And if I was about to take a test, what test question would I get for on this topic? And then that keeps me kind of, we talked about attention, that keeps me focused on rather than, hey, what's the dog doing out there? Looks kind of fun.
I tend to kind of have this ADHD thing too, George. When I'm reading, I can be reading and I can drop down to a lower level of consciousness while I'm reading. And my mind's thinking about something else. And then I don't retain, I can be sleeping at times, but I don't retain the information. So what I have to do, George, is I have to take notes and do an outline while I'm reading something so that I'm engaged. If I'm just reading it, I'm not taking notes, I have a really hard time retaining it. But if I take the notes, what I find oftentimes is I don't need the notes. If I'm taking notes, I think, oh, I'm going to need these notes because I'm going to share this. Oftentimes I'm able to remember it because I wrote it while I heard it, and then I saw it on the paper after I wrote it. And so I think, again, by having more than just my eyesight, but I'm able to look at it and using my hand and the kinesthetic, writing, all of those things help me to retain it longer term than if I just read something and I'm just reading, my retention's really bad. And so I've had to learn in school that's not enough for me. Some people can do great with that. And again, we're all wired differently. For me, I need to be taking notes and writing things and processing it and engaging in critical thinking to really retain it.
You know what's funny, Craig? The best teacher I ever had in high school was Father Brainerd. He was our physics teacher, and he was just an amazing teacher. And he said, you can bring in 1 page of notes because we do midterms and finals and all that. You can bring in 1 page of notes. So we'd all, we'd be writing down all of our notes, and we wouldn't need them.
Because you remember, you retained it because of that second step. It is the hear, read, whatever, and there has to be an and. Typically, I guess may not be the correct terminology, but typically for the best learning, there needs to be an and. What else are you doing with that? And so whether you're quizzing yourself, you're writing it down, you're speaking it out loud, there needs to be the and part for best retention. Yeah.
Oh, that's outstanding. use the and. So I think Father Brainerd was a learning genius because he helped us. If he got me through physics, he was a genius. All right. Any final overs before we check out? That was some amazing content about learning, and specifically ways that people can retain the content better. Any last thoughts before we jump out of here?
Appreciate you all. Thank you.
Thank you for listening.
This was brought to you by the Psychology Department at Los Angeles Pacific University. And we are just so happy that you're here to listen and learn about learning.